Hello and welcome to episode 171 of the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and 10 years ago I gave up my life's dream and career as a radio presenter with one big regret. Never getting to interview my hero, the legendary singer, songwriter and musician, Paul Weller. This podcast exists purely to solve that issue. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Paul. This episode of the podcast goes live on the 3rd of November 2023, exactly 45 years to the day that the Jam's All Mod Cons was released. Yes, 3rd of November 1978. And what an album. So how do we celebrate? Well, how about this? On the podcast, we hear from All Mod Cons, the world's first tribute to the Jam. Barry Pugatch and Andy Cook share their story. We will chat to these two fans of the Jam who ended up bringing one of the original tribute bands from the US to the UK for sellout performances in the 1990s. All Mod Cons were created in Boston, New England in 1989 with Barry as Paul Weller on lead vocals and guitar with his mates Glenn on bass, yes, Bruce Foxton if you like, and AJ, Rick Buckler, on drums. What follows is a remarkable story of connections via a Paul Weller fanzine that saw Andy take on management of the band to bring them to the UK for tours in the 90s and noughties. Now, this was pre-From the Jam, pre-The Gift. It was really pre-tribute bands, bar the odd couple, like Bjorn again and Australian Pink Floyd. At the time, All Mod Cons were also really the only way to hear a full set of those classic songs by the Jam, by a three-piece, live in concert. In this podcast chat, you'll also hear how they both got to meet and interact with Paul, Bruce, and Rick on various occasions, and even how Barry got to jam with Paul in a unique location. I'm really looking forward to this one. Let's get into it. All Mod Cons on the podcast. Barry Pugatch, thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks for having us on.
And thank you, Andy Cook, for joining us as well.
Pleasure. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Oh, this is lovely. So, Barry, tell me where in the world you are right now.
I'm in Boston, Massachusetts. I actually work at MIT now. Was able to get a little bit of time out of my day to do this. I was very excited for the opportunity to talk about our love of the Jam, as well as I did want to, I was thinking about it too. You know, Andy, this is also a nice celebration of our friendship drawn together 30 years simply because we both love this band in the same man, if you will. I know this is audio only, but over my shoulder is a poster that Andy gave me the first time we met. And it's a picture from NME of a very young Paul Weller jumping in the air with the black and white shoes. And he's looking fantastic. At some point in life, the great man autographed it for me. A nice celebration of my friendship with Andy too.
And by the great man, you mean Paul Weller rather than Andy, just to clear that up, right?
Yes. So originally when I met Paul, he actually said to me, he's like, so for those of you who don't know who I am, I actually fronted a wonderful Jam tribute band for about 30 years because I love the music so much. And when I met Paul and pulled out this poster, he looks at me and the first thing he said was, "You're in that band."
I love it.
He then followed up with, "What's it like make a living out of me?" And I actually said to him, I said, "We don't really make any money at all." I said, "We're happy to break even if it's at all possible. Sometimes we lose a few £100 here and there. We do it because we love the music so much. You know, we're fans." He really liked that. He went, "Well, that's cool." And I'm talking about how much we love the music, the energy, the passion, the excitement. And he's like, "That's all right then." Yeah. So I actually said to him, he's like, "So what do you want me to write?" And I literally said, "I've got my American sense of humor." And I said, "Could you please write, Barry, all Mod Cons are a bunch of wankers." And he looked and he says, "I'm not going to write that." So he wrote, if you look closely, it says, "To Barry and all Mod Cons, stay cool." You know?
You'll have to send us a photo of that and we'll put it in the show notes, Barry. That would be lovely. We'll dig into your first connection with the Jam in a second. But Andy, let's talk to you. So where in the UK are you right now?
Well, I am in sunny Wimbledon at the moment.
Oh, okay. You could have popped over. I'm just up the road from you.
No way.
We could have sat in my little garden office together and linked in. Anyway, so we're going to dig into your story. We're going to talk about how you two connected through this love of the Jam. But Andy, obviously being in the UK, the Jam were a much bigger deal here than they were stateside. So let's talk about your discovery of that band, first of all, in the presumably late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, so it would have been early 80s. So I was born in 1970. When I went to school, I grew up in Worthing. I went to school there, and there were a few kids that were into the jam because I guess you sort of I became aware of music around the age of 10, 11, 12, like really got fanatical about it. So by the age of 12, the jam were breaking up. There was all this stuff going on at the time with people that were really into them about stop and breaking up and, all that sort of stuff that's been well documented. And I sort of got in off the tail end of that, started to listen to the albums almost obsessively every morning before going to school and stuff. And it just stuck. And I can remember playing All Mod Cons to death before school and after school. And it became really weird to meet Paul a bit further down the track because it's like meeting this person that played such an amazing part in my sort of early years, coming through the speakers every morning. When I started going to gigs, I used to go and watch the Style Council a lot and followed them around, went to a bunch of shows, including the ill-fated Royal Albert Hall. But I loved the Style Council. I loved just the energy of those shows and how much the fans seem to be a part of the whole thing. And I've never really experienced that in any of the other shows that I've ever been to with any other artists. It's just maybe it's just something at the time. It was just intoxicating and just brilliant.
Your connection with the jam is through the albums, through the singles, most of which have been, you've not had that kind of rush of queuing to get them. Starting your morning every day with a Weller album or the jam albums, it's a terrific idea. The
L33 used to go on and throw the needle onto the record. And that's how I used to eat my breakfast and listen to a few tracks of an album. And being an obsessive sort of person, it used to be the same tracks over and over.
What happened with me is I got into the jam just after they broke up. So I had a college roommate at university and he had sound effects and he had the 45 it came with a bonus 45 of Going Underground. He just played the crap out of that and we had the best time with it. And then one of the most influential things on me was there was a live performance of the jam at the Paradise in Boston, recorded in 1979. That was a radio show that, that they would play once a year and we waited for it. We're like, it's coming. And we hit record and we had it. And I was just completely crazy for it. Because what was nice was it had a lot of very heavy Paul Weller accent kind of going between the tracks. And he would say things like, all right, fuck the table, fuck the chairs, stand up straight, we want you here. And he'd say these things. And I was like, this is so cool. And I started collecting the jam, and I was also very obsessed by this band. And suddenly I had to have it all. I had to give me all the records, give me all the stuff. And I started to accumulate it. And pre-internet, I saw an ad for a fanzine called Boys About Town that came out of Dundee, Scotland. And I wrote this guy, Andy. It was two guys, Andy and David. And I wrote Andy saying, I have these jam things. I have some VHS tapes, some performances. Do you have those? Can I trade you for those? And I sent him a bunch of stuff. He sent me a bunch of stuff. And at the time, I was in a band that we used to play a lot of 80s music. And suddenly I'm like, we got to start playing some jam stuff. And then my good friend Glenn, it's hard to kind of keep this together because there's a lot that kind of went on at once. But Glenn and I had seen Beatlemania. And we're like, we should do a show like this. This would be so cool. We could take it maybe outside. Maybe we could get a show in New York. Maybe we could play Philadelphia because we had missed the jam and we were so bummed about not being able to do it. But we started playing some of the tracks and then we're like, we're going to form a band. We're going to just do the music of the jam. And this is going to be fantastic. And I sent a cassette to Andy in Scotland, said, by the way, I'm in a band and we do the music of the jam. And at the time, Paul wasn't doing anything. The jam was done. There was nothing, Andy, I sent him a cassette and he's like, this is actually pretty good, Barry. For being Americans, you guys, he wrote a very nice thing. And he actually said, can you get a review of one of your shows? So we actually wrote it.
Brilliant. No
saying how wonderful we were, but it was an actual show. We put these are the tracks that they did. Barry's guitar was exciting. He sounded just like Paul Weller. It was incredible. And so Andy Wyness and David Lodge, they printed this in the little fanzine. And I believe that's where Andy Cook here read it And he was a young man in his early 20s. He basically wrote me a letter saying, can you send me a set? Let me give it a listen. He gave me a fairly honest criticism, but he's like, I'd like to start managing bands. This is something I've always wanted to do. Would you guys like to come over? I believe this was 1991. And he booked us a pub tour. What was cool was people came. So from Boston, USA, All Mod Cons, a tribute to the Jam. And people miss this music so much. That's where we show up, and we're a pretty good band, but people love the tracks. They love the music. And we just had we would just fill in this void that was left in people's hearts. We did 3 shows, London, Brighton, and then one of the shows had gotten canceled. And then this guy had seen us on the Wednesday saying, how'd you like to come to Blackpool and play a mod rally? I'll give you guys, $300 or whatever it was to cover the expenses. So we went up to Blackpool. Andy made it all happen. There was like 600 or 700 people all dressed in the same mod suits that we're wearing. And we're just ripping into it. Here we go, And,
I love it.
And they just loved it. And then Andy's like, Baz, he's like, what was funny, so Andy's called me Baz for a very long time. The very first letter I have from Andy, I kind of dug that out, and he calls me Baz in the first letter. But that was the beginning of our friendship. But that was also the beginning of a very exciting part of our lives where you are getting to share your love as a fan to all these other people, and to have people come and play bigger and bigger venues. Even if there were no great fortunes involved, it was still a joyous part of my life. And then occasionally things would happen where we're like, oh, how'd you like to come back to England? How'd you like to go to Canada? 3
of you obviously in the band. We're replicating the Jam perfectly. So Glenn, you mentioned, is the Bruce Foxton in the band.
Yep.
You had AJ, who's your Rick Buckler on drums. Tribute bands were a thing in the US. They weren't really a thing over here, were they? But they were a thing in the States, right?
You didn't really see them in the US either.
Okay.
So we were like one of the first tribute bands. So in the United States, the only bands you ever saw was there was the Australian Doors and Bjorn again and us. And then there was Beatlemania, which was more of a Broadway show. But we had envisioned it almost like a Beatlemania kind of thing. We seemed to do better with the punkier fast songs. So the 77 to 79 was kind of our sweet spot for a lot of the material. But so much of it was just so much fun. But to stand up on a stage in front of 900 people at the Marquee, or Brighton Center East Wing. And Andy was always very good about shielding me from a lot of the stress he was under, because sometimes he's like, Baz, it's good we got 900 people because we weren't going to break even otherwise.
Now, Andy, you see this article in the fanzine, and in terms of time, we're talking about, this is the end of the Style Council now. So this is, this is Paul Weller's without a record deal. The Jam's music, we've not had the greatest hits again. We've not had extras. It's not back on the radar really, but there's still obviously a big following. There's still people who are lapping this up. There's still the fanzines and stuff like that. It was through that you connected, right?
Yeah. And I wrote to Paul Weller and said about 1991 or 2 and asked if I could go and interview him for the same fanzine that Barry's talking about. And I got a letter back from him saying, yeah, come up. Me and my school friend Alan, who was a really big Jam fan, went from Worthing up to No Miss Studios, sort of walked in there, and John Weller was there. He went, all right, boys. Oh, yeah. Have a seat over there. Paul will be with you in a minute, and all this sort of stuff. And it was just bizarre because, as I said, this is a guy, his music had played such a major part in my life. Never expected him to reply and say, yeah, come and interview me or whatever.
The thing that strikes me about that is how bloody easy that was. You didn't have to create a podcast with 160 odd episodes, did you? No, absolutely not. But I don't even know if anyone would have been able to spell podcast back then. You're talking about a time when there was no internet, there's no mobile phones, there's no nothing. So I used to see the address on the back of the Torch Society stuff, whatever it was, No Miss Studios, Sinclair Road. So even from that perspective, it was accessible, and you could probably get a phone number from somewhere if you wanted to ring up. And I used to hear stories of people saying, well, I rang up, I'm sure Weller answered the phone back then. So yeah, he wrote back and said, yeah, come. And so we organised a date. I can't remember how the date got sorted. So we schlepped up to No Miss, and all of a sudden he was sat there. And I remember it because he was rehearsing for that first Paul Weller movement tour. Absolutely nothing going on. Those venues that they booked, I remember going to one of those shows after we saw him at the Top Rank in Brighton, half full. It was like an audience of 250. It was ridiculous. But there we were. And me and my mate printed out the questions that we were going to ask. We gave him a copy of them. And it was all the usual stuff, how do you feel about Rick and Bruce and da-da-da-da. But he answered them, and he was really, really chatty.
And the thing that struck me about him then the most was how, I don't know what age he would have been in 91, 92, but probably still relatively young, but he just had so much wisdom about him. You know, you sort of start talking about things and he just sort of exuded this sort of knowledge, not in a big ego way, but he was just incredibly chatty. So we sat there, smoked all his fags and chatted for 2 And I recorded the interview on those little tapes, you know, the sort of dictaphone things, wrote it out, long form, sent him a copy because he said, could you send me a copy of it? About 5 days later, I get a letter back saying, really nice to meet you, but that interview's really dull. And he said, maybe that's just because I was dull on the day. He said, but it's a really dull interview.
So, oh my God. This is now filling me full of fear if I do get that interview with him.
I've still got the letter. It's like, okay, well, what do you do with that? You know, but then, you know, it probably was quite dull the way we've written it up. But that was the first experience of seeing that whole kind of world of Solid Bond and No Miss and all the rest of it. And just kind of sort of seeing him as being a person, which sounds ridiculous, but, you know, you have these idols. They never really sort of come across in the mind as being human necessarily. He was great. He was so nice. And him and his dad were off to see Lennox Lewis fight that night somewhere. So they halfway through, John interrupts. What time shall I pick you up? They said, well, we're going to see the Lennox Lewis fight tonight. So, well, come round about 6 and we'll drive up there to Wembley or wherever it was. Yeah, it's that sort of stuff, you know.
Isn't that wonderful? I love it.
That interview then went into this fanzine and Barry and I must have crossed over from there. I saw the review or did something or other. And so, yeah, I wrote to Barry. I don't know his address in Boston must have been published in the thing and said, I don't really know what I'm doing, but sounds like a good idea. Are you going to come over and do some shows? And that's how it started. So they said yes. And about probably 2 or 3 months later, they ended up coming and sleeping on my mum and dad's floor in Worthing. And we did the first show at the Hare and Hounds in Brighton, which was packed. And my Uncle Tub did the security with him and his big stick. It was oversubscribed and I didn't know what I was doing. I got them a PA, which was about 100 watts or something. And it just didn't work. That's how the whole thing started. It was just amazing. But the energy that came from those shows and from people just really, just loving the songs and the music and all that sort of stuff. It was just addictive as well, just to be in that sort of atmosphere. It was amazing.
Russell Hastings and I had a similar conversation like really early on the podcast. I think it was like episode 3 maybe. I asked him what it felt like to be Paul Weller. And Barry, I'll ask you the same question because these songs have such magic, such power, such love. But you're the front man. You're the lead member of the band. What does it feel like to be up there singing these songs?
You feel like they're yours. You know, like you sit there and you're like, what are we going to pull out now? You're looking at your friend Glenn and go, Glenn, we got to do Tube Station. And you're just like, because you know you're going to get the reaction. Because of the songs, you feel like you're actually controlling the crowd. And that's crazy. Like we played in Glasgow, right? We played at this place called the Cat House. We played it like 3 or 4 times. And you would see people against the crash barrier just smashing themselves. And you're like, you see the sea of these people. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. You know, the energy of these songs to be able to kind of harness that like it's your special, I'm going to get them now. I'm going to pull out Ahmad Khan's Into To Be Someone, into It's Too Bad. And we're going to flap them all together. Then I'm going to write. And then you're like, I'm going to go right into the modern world. Then I'm going to do Art School. That'd be like 7 songs in a row. They're going to freak out. And you know you've got that is an amazing thing. Plus to be playing on a big stage with a big PA, you know, you're just like, oh, this sounds so big. But there was just such a joy. And I will say, so Russell and I got to do Paul Weller at the same time. So Russell put together a tour. He was doing something, I think he was calling it the Paul Weller Council at the time, where he was going around. He basically phoned me up and he's like, I saw you at the Marquee. Do you guys want to come over? You can use our stuff. You know, so he basically provided the back line. He let me use his Rickenbackers. Russell is wonderful because to meet another Paul Weller frontman, and Russell is going through the Rick and I'm like, wow, your Rick sounds cool. And he's like, oh, Barry, the trick is you got to use 11s. He goes, I noticed you had 10s on yours. He goes, no, you got to go with the heavy gauge. That's the only way you're going to get it to really ring like Paul. And he's like, oh, and he goes, Paul would never use that pedal. You know, you need to use, yeah, but it's too cool. Yeah. So Russ was doing the music of Paul Weller's solo career, you know, and we were doing the early jam stuff, and he was gracious enough to let us headline. But I had some wonderful experience with Russell. We had one where they were doing something called The Gift, and it was Rick Buckler's The Gift. And he invited, at the time, my son Max is 50. At the time, he's like 14, 15 years old, and Max is playing the drums. And who do you think his favorite drummer is? Anybody? Any guesses?
Phil Collins.
Okay. We are in Hastings, my son and I, and we have an invitation to come see Russ's band play with Rick Buckler on drums. So my son, who's 15 years old, is helping Rick Buckler carry in his stuff. And Max is so excited. And of course, I'm excited because it's Rick Buckler, man. And he's carrying him in, and Max pulls out the cowbell. Now, I had never seen the actual cowbell before. And so that cowbell that Rick uses is the size of like a loaf of bread. It's huge. It's the most redonkulous thing you've ever seen. And Max looks at Rick Buckler and says, "Is this the cowbell from A-Bomb and Wardour Street?" And Rick looks very pleased. And he says, "Why, yes, Max, it is." And so we help Rick set up. We hang out. Rick is actually palling around with Max a little bit, which is unbelievable. They made special arrangements. So again, how nice are they to do this? So Rick and Russ made special arrangements so that my son, who's underage, could watch from behind the crash barrier up front. And then after the show, we thank them. We're off to go do, we're off to get a pizza or whatever. And it's raining. Max and I are walking back to our bed and breakfast. And who is walking down the street looking a little wet and a little confused, but Rick Buckler. And he looks and he goes, "Barry, Max," he just says, "I'm in real trouble." He goes, "I don't have my phone. I don't have my wallet. My car is locked in the garage. I didn't realize the garage closed early." He goes, "I am totally in trouble here." And he's like, "I don't know how to reach Russ. I don't know how I'm going to get home." And I'm like, "I have Russ's phone number in my wallet." I just wrote his thing on a card. And so we're in a phone booth and Max is like, "I have change." So we're in one of those red British phone boxes with Rick Buckler in the rain, calling Russ to come back and pick him up. and afterwards, and Max is looking at me and Max says, "Dad, this is so surreal to be in a phone booth with Rick Buckler, who is one of our idols, if you will, who's a regular guy, who's super cool." Rick says to Max, "Max, you have saved my life because I will always be indebted to you." And then maybe 2 years later, the From the Jam thing is really kind of blown up. Like it's really doing well. And they come back and they are at I think it's the Gramercy Theater in New York, which is a big, big venue. And we show up for sound check. At that point, Bruce is on bass. Russ is singing. Rick is on drums. Our friend Dave is playing kind of keyboards and backups. And we walk into sound check, me and Max, and the voice from the stage says, "Max, don't I still owe you 50p?"
I love it. I love the fact that the connections with the fans like that never change. I mean, that's always been consistent throughout the 45 years on. Fans have those kind of stories.
This is another generation of fan too. This isn't me. This is my son.
Are you force feeding the Jam to him in the same way as I'm trying to with my kids?
So I would play cassettes, and then eventually CDs, all through the 90s. And so my son was born in 1990 and that's what he grew up on. So as a toddler, he could sing you That's Entertainment or any Jam song you could do.
Now, Andy, I should ask you, I mean, obviously the connection for you with All Mod Cons was around the time of Paul, I guess, coming back, if you like. Those tours do pick up, thank goodness. We're not playing to half empty venues for Paul Weller solo. We get that first solo album, we get Wildwood, we get Stanley Road. But alongside it, this love of the Jam is really strong again. Even Paul starts playing some more Jam songs in his sets and stuff. So it's like the kind of two are side by side, if you like. So you must have noticed, I mean, there's a real opportunity there to tap into that market when Paul's on the rise himself again, right?
Yeah, kind of. But the whole thing about this was it was never really anything entrepreneurial. Maybe it should have been, but we sort of, because Barry and the others worked. So the tours were around when Barry's his ex-wife would let him come over because Max and his daughter were still young. And so even if we could do something which was more commercial, it was impossible because like a maximum of 2 tours a year. And the amount of money it took to put the thing on the road and all the rest of it, there was never any chance of anything commercial happening. And actually, that changed for the worst because we ended up having Martin Hopewell as our agent, right? Well, primary talent, but Martin was one of the directors of it. Because things we used to go to venues which were 1,000, 1,500 and nearly pretty much sell them out if not sell them out. The agent for Bjorn, again, a guy called Paul Franklin, who works for Primary, wanted to be our agent. So they had to get permission from Paul Weller HQ to be able to do that, which obviously happened. But because then you're into working with agents and promoters and everyone's taking a cut, and then there's the tour expenses and all this sort of stuff, it was really difficult to break even, let alone do anything else. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was never really an entrepreneurial thing. It just gathered momentum. There wasn't really any alternative. There wasn't any other sort of live way of seeing the Jam music in quite that sort of setting. And I think it just captured a moment in time, really. Yeah, the Martin Hopewell thing. And I remember talking to Dennis Monday about, so I can't remember how that happened. He said, oh, got some Jam stuff you might be interested in. And he was living in a place called Boughton-on-Chelsea in Kent. So me and John, who was one of the other guys from All My Cons who sort of came in and out, we arranged to go down to see him. He said, by the way, but I've got to tell you, I've broken my back. This is Dennis Monday.
That's all that breakdancing in the Style Council years, wasn't it? That's what that was.
Yeah, right. He said, I've broken my back, so I'm a bit immobile. He said, and I've been sleeping on a bed in the front room because I can't get up the stairs. He said, but we still managed to go for a drink. So we went down there and we knocked on the door and he's opened. He's got some sort of cravat. He's very stiff and moving very awkwardly. You can see in the front room, he had his bed there. He said, we'll just go down the castle, wherever it was, for a couple of drinks. And yeah, I think it must have been purely medicinal for his back because we stayed there for a very long time. He ended up giving us this cassette of some unreleased stuff. This was, again, before much of that had ever really started to come out, of a song called Best of Both Worlds, which actually was a Bruce song. So he said, oh, see what you want to do with that. And so they, All My Cons recorded it and then put it into the live stuff. But all of those sorts of things, it's just like being in the most ridiculous situations with these people that were so formative in all of that stuff and were just delightful in terms of giving time and telling stories and, and all that sort of thing. We were really lucky. I saw Dennis I reminded him about this. I saw him at that thing that they did up in Liverpool, the exhibition that Nicky Weller did and stuff. And he was there. And I reminded him, he sort of vaguely remembered. He obviously remembered breaking his back, but he vaguely remembered the time we went to the pub. But I think that's because he was too pissed. He couldn't remember anything. But it was never really an entrepreneurial thing. It couldn't have been. I later went on and managed bands full time, did some tours with Paul Weller with some of the bands or one of the bands that I managed. But with All My Cons, there was never any opportunity to make money, really.
Let's dig into that a little bit. So what was the band that you managed that were on the lineup with Paul? And presumably you're then on the road with the Wellers, right?
So I had a band called Rooster. They were a three-piece. Guy had a really soulful voice. They liked the group. So agreed to put them on the tour support. They used to put them into segments. So we had the Southwest and some other stuff and into the Midlands. But you're on your own. You have to travel to the De Montfort Hall in Leicester or wherever it was on your own. Very rarely do you kind of get to see Paul or whatever. But there were times when he would come and watch backstage, or they would say, oh, there's catering left over. Do you want that? Any one of a number of things that you actually then started, as you started to get to know people, it was a bit more integrated. They were so nice. They were really, really nice. And he, again, just showed such a nice side of him. He talked to Jamie, the lead singer of Rooster, about songwriting and other stuff. And, they played some songs to each other and they were just delightful. Once they trusted, I think it was that sort of, I've heard it on your podcast, they talk about having a well-oiled machine with Kenny Wheeler and all that sort of stuff behind it. And that's exactly what it was like, and the security and all the rest of it. But I think once you get trusted a bit, the barriers start to come down.
How many gigs does it take until you get invited into the card school?
Well, so that was probably 6, and I managed to dodge that one. It was at I remember it really well. It was the Ramada at Reading, and there was Wheeler, John Weller, and Chris Craddock, so Steve Craddock's dad. And it was about midnight, and someone said, oh, well, about time to play cards. And so I can't remember who it was. I said to me, because I was standing near them, you want to play card? Play card? I managed to say no, because just my instinct. And when I looked over, they were like really hard at it. We left about 2 or 3 in the morning, and they were still going. And there was a lot of money on the table. And it looked, they were taking it really seriously. I can't remember how many people were playing, but I really dodged a bullet there because I thought I could just see my house going, all that sort of stuff, forever. But they were seriously into that. Yeah. The card school, the notoriety around that, as far as I'm concerned, seems to become well justified. All those guys they were really nice.
Now, Barry, I should ask you about the Style Council. Was that a thing for you, or was it solely the Jam?
I did not get into the Style Council till well after my friendship with Andy was established, because Andy was like, you need to give this a chance. I had pretty much shut off from the Style Council altogether. And Andy was like, no. He's like, our favorite shop is good. You need to be able to, I think he started me off with the Singular Adventures of the Style Council. He's like, this will just get you in there. But I was not into the style council quite so much. It was much more all about the jam and the raw, the raw energetic sound of the jam in that period,
In recent years, Paul's looked at his whole career as kind of one big catalogue, right? So on tour, you'll have songs from the Jam. He'll play stuff from the Style Council. He'll play what are now oldies in the Paul Weller solo years. We're talking about a 30-year career, right? So, and obviously a lot of new stuff. Even on his latest tour, he's doing songs that haven't even been released yet. But when you think about the Jam, he's talked about the fact that he finds it quite hard to connect with some of those songs because they are young man's songs, because they are songs, not just the energy of how they perform, but the lyrics of them are talking about you in your teens. As you got older yourself, Barry, did you find it harder to connect with those songs too?
No, because I'm still a teenager. Even though I'm now 60, nothing gets your blood going like a great jam song. And sometimes I'll get away from the music a little bit. Then you put back in the disc for the commute into work. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is great stuff. So you go back and it's still fresh and you still remember the feeling that you had the first time you heard it. And for me, imagine the joy of the first time you got to play it for other people, and to actually do it.
That reflection from Weller is interesting, isn't it? Because when you look at some of the lyrics that he wrote as a 17, 18, 19-year-old person, like Burning Sky and Just Who's the 5 O'Clock Hero and some of that stuff, without actually life experience of some of those situations, because it would be impossible to have life experience of all of the things that he wrote about, but just the insight and the sort of poetic way that he managed to craft those lyrics is still outstanding and astonishing. And I don't think he necessarily gets the credit for that as a songwriter that he deserves, because some of that stuff, some of those lyrics, who could come up with that at that age? It's amazing.
Musically, there's something magical about what it does to your blood and your blood pressure and the way your mind can travel and soar with these stories. Because you have to remember too, I'm American. I have no idea what a cortina is, but I would actually try to learn, and again, I was learning off of some of the stuff that we would do in our show. Some of the lyrics, I misinterpreted them because you didn't have the lyric sheet for all mod cons yet. So imagine trying to get through artistic freedom, do what you want, but some of the songs, and I'm going to be honest, and I apologize for anybody that saw all mod cons, is I never got all the lyrics for some of the songs, but I would do this kind of heavy, all right, here we are, and do the song. So even if I didn't understand the lyrics, I could kind of get through the song. We actually got to do a visit to Woking. And to me, going to Woking was like going to the Holy Land. That's as good as a trip to Jerusalem. I'm good, and to go to Woking and somebody took us around and then we got to play a show. And I actually asked the good people of Woking, so how is my Woking accent? And they said it was shit.
This was the Fiery Bird, wasn't it, in Woking?
Yeah. Fiery Bird, yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Were there venues over here where you went, those are the ones? I mean, you mentioned the Marquee, but there were venues over here that you were like, we've got to play there.
We got to play the Hope and Anchor, because to me, that was the famous jam spot, as far as I was concerned. The Wheat Chief Pub, I don't know where that was, but it was a big deal to play the Marquee. We sold it out. Like we played it 3 times, but we actually filled it. And I'm going to be very candid. We didn't fill it because we are the world's greatest band. We filled it because we did the music of the world's greatest band. And to share that with 900 people is a great honor and a great gift to get to do that. And that's something you'll always treasure. And that's something sometimes I'll talk to Andy and I'll just say, Andy, some of the greatest moments of our lives were shared together. Andy had one, we were Brighton Center East Wing, and he's like, Baz, he goes, when I look at you jumping up and down, trying to punch a hole in the bottom of that stage with the Rickenbacker and you got the big Marshalls behind you, that is the coolest thing ever. And Andy's like, when I looked at that, Barry, and I see the lights and I see the sea of people going up and down, and you play best of both worlds. Imagine that. You're playing an unreleased jam track that they ever did. And Andy's like, how lucky are we to know that we got to do this is so cool.
It's funny mentioning the Marquee, because on one of the shows, I got this message from someone to say, "Oh, Mr. Coppersmith's here." Well, that was a bit strange. So I went out to the front, and there's Vic Coppersmith Heaven standing there in this sort of white suit. So it's really out of place. And a fantastic Hawaiian shirt, I think.
Yep.
It's really open at the chest, revealing a lovely,
like David Hasselhoff. I love it.
Yeah, but not quite so well coiffed. I think I'd say it's a little bit overgrown there. But anyway, and he showed up and then sort of came in and watched the show and stuff. I just thought, well, what's that about? He said, "Oh, I'm just really intrigued to see what this band's like live and stuff." He sort of still had this sort of presence about him, but be confronted with this guy who has sort of produced them so much and been so again, it's just one of those sort of weird moments. Gary Crowley and people like that as well will come and watch. And so it's people that have been really involved in the Jam sort of way back when, and a part of that whole sort of movement and scene came and saw us. Yeah, it was just weird. I was just sort of reflecting on this earlier because I didn't really get a chance to think about it that much. But just some of that stuff, it was so surreal.
I mean, this has taken you all over the place, all over the States. We talked about Canada, but it was nice that you came back to the UK. So you mentioned 2019. It had been, 15 years, I think, since you'd been here. And you came back to do 5 shows as like a farewell, all mod cons type thing, right, Barry?
Yeah. So we had toured with a wonderful band. 2 of the tours in the early mid-90s was a band called The Direction, which was a fantastic, and one of the guys ended up being the bass player from My Life Story, which is a wonderful band. And then this other wonderful guy, Ivano, pinged me off of LinkedIn and just said, "Hey, Barry, I'm coming to America. Would you like to, meet for dinner?" And then we finally chatted. He's like, "I'd like to come back to England again." He's like, "I'll set it up." He goes, "You can use our stuff." And he's like, "Where do you want to play?" And I had the joy, again, another unbelievable experience. I'm like, we got to do the Hope and Anchor, because I also knew that, we haven't been there in a long time, and the Hope and Anchor is not a huge place. And I'm like, that'll be a great Saturday night show. And I and my son, who had never seen me play live, because you have to think about, he wasn't old enough for a lot of the shows in the 90s. He was 4 and 5 years old and 6 years old. And suddenly my son is now 30, and he's like, "Dad," he goes, I'll come to England and I'll bring my friends." So my son flew out with, I think, 5 of his friends. They actually all got tattoos. They got English roses on their shoulders.
Brilliant.
And my son shows up at the Hope and Anchor, and he is so proud and so excited. And of course, his friends are saying, "Your dad's the coolest dad ever." But this guy comes in and he's wearing an All Mod Cons t-shirt that he bought in 1992. And it's got the logo, and he's showing Max. Actually, this was 94 because my son would have been 4. And Max goes, "I remember those shirts because we had some unsold ones, and he used to wear them as night shirts because they went down to his ankles." But that kind of came full circle. If I can, I want to talk about 2 other things that were really important to me that in terms of how nice the Jam really were. Okay. I'd like to start with Paul. Now, one of the things I'm going to do, so the people at home can't see this, but I'm just going to go into my virtual backgrounds and I'm going to change it. Now, the people at home can't see this, but I'm going to describe it to you. Okay. So this is me jamming with Paul, and we're actually in a men's room. Okay. So I'm going to back away so that Dan can see the sink. Okay, there it is.
So just in terms of period, this is what, early 90s then? 93, something like that maybe?
I'm actually wearing that shirt. So this has got to be 93, 94, I bet. Yeah. He's actually playing the Ovation from That's Entertainment, which is super cool. Okay. So previous to this, Paul would come to America and he wouldn't necessarily be playing the hugest places. So I had seen him at this one venue. It was Berkeley Performance Center, which is a beautiful venue. And I'm there outside with my Rickenbacker, hoping to get it signed. I'm a fan. You got to remember that. I'm a huge fan. Okay. And I've got my red Rickenbacker, and I am jonesing to have Paul sign my Rickenbacker. And who comes out but John Weller? And John Weller is so nice. And he just looks and he says, "Oh, what? You want Paul to sign this? Yeah, come on." And he takes me inside backstage. I'm like, "Who does this?" And he hands Paul my guitar, and Paul starts to strum it. I am so excited. I'm like, Paul Weller is playing my guitar, and I am very excited. So John's like, "Oh, come on, you can meet Paul." So I see Paul again. This is our second meeting, and he autographs my Rickenbacker, and if you can see, there's actually signatures on the Rickenbacker. Dan, I don't know if you can see that. And then I'm like, "Oh, so where are you guys going afterwards?" Like, "Let me hang out with you." And they're like, somebody told me. They're like, "Oh, we're going back to the Copley Plaza Hotel." And so I'm at the bar at the Copley Plaza Hotel, keeping my respectful distance. And first I'm like, well, we're going to send John Weller a Kahlua sombrero. That's what he's drinking. So I send John Weller a Kahlua sombrero. And Paul is chatting with Helen Turner and Steve White. I'm like, I go, and there's Dave Little. Dave Little is super cool. Dave Little's a funny guy. And I'm just like, again, I'm trying not to be too much of a pest, but I'm pretty excited, so I got my photo with that. And then they start handing my guitar around because I brought it up to the bar and everybody signs it. So Steve White signs it. Helen signs it. Camille Hines signs it. And I'm thinking like, geez, I got the style council on this now. This is getting sweet. I got to get a few more. I just got to get the only signature I was missing. And Bruce had signed it. I saw Bruce in Newcastle when we were on tour. Bruce invited us down and I brought my guitar for Bruce to sign. So suddenly I'm thinking there's going to be a jam reunion on my guitar. This is going to be super cool. So I'm like, I just got to get Rick to sign it at some point, right? That's all I'm thinking, right? And I asked Paul, this is at a hotel bar. I go, so Paul, Man in the Corner Shop, what's the lick? And I'm going up, it's D, then the B minor. He goes, no. He goes, here. And he takes the guitar and Paul Weller is showing me how to play Man in the Corner Shop. I tell this to Andy, and Andy, of course, is thinking, gee, Baz, this isn't a bad thing to tell the press. So he basically says, Solid Bond and Paul Weller have given all Mod Cons the seal of approval. And Paul has even showed Barry the chords to a couple of the tunes, right? So this is a couple years later. Paul is playing at Avalon in Boston. I have seen Kenny Wheeler enough times that I don't get. There's a verb that I don't know if your friends are familiar with. The verb is being wheelered. So wheelered is when you were kicked out of sound check. Kenny would come by and he goes, all right, boys, that's it. Get out, and he'd push you out of sound check. Kenny Wheeler no longer wheelers me because he knows me by sight. And I basically am in sound check and I'm watching them do it. And it's basically Steve White just whomping away on his drum. They're trying to get the drum sound. They can't get it. And I'm like, Paul Weller has picked up the ovation and he has gone into the men's room to hear himself because acoustically, it's just a nightmare and the club is just. And I'm like, Paul Weller has gone into the men's room. Perhaps I will follow and just pretend like, so I'm in there kind of like washing my hands, trying to pretend like I'm sitting there and I'm wearing my All Mod Cons t-shirt. I'm saying hello. I asked him, I said, Paul, I'm like, I've got my Rickenbacker in the car. Right out front, I've got this little battery operated amp and I'm thinking, would you just do a song with me? And he looks at me and he goes, it's all right. And I'm like, oh, and I am so excited. Okay. Cause I'm a fan, baby. And I run outside, get the guitar out of the trunk and I just run right past security with the guitar. I sit up and I am starting to shake and I see my friend Vinny always has, he calls it his poxy camera. So Vinny always has a camera that he would sneak a little portable throwaway camera in his underpants into the show. And he would always take pictures, not great pictures, but this is pre-phones. So I'm like, Vinny, follow me into the men's room. I'm about to jam with Paul Weller. I'm sitting there. So Paul looks at me. He goes, so what do you want to play? At this point, he was not playing jam songs. I'm like, let's do Into Tomorrow, which is the single off the first album, which is a wonderful tune. And we used to play it as All Mod Cons. We used to encore with it sometimes. So we had played it. And he's like, all right. So I find myself doing my impression of Paul Weller to Paul Weller. And I'm doing it. And it's kind of clicking. And Paul's like, no, slow it down. He goes, you got to let it breathe. But obviously I'm excited, so I'm rushing it. And he's like, no, Barry, you got this. So I'm sawing through it. Vinny's taking his photos and snapping away. We finish. I thank him. He looks at my guitar and he says, oh, you saw Bruce. How's he doing? And I'm like, Bruce was great. Like he kind of knew, but at that point, I guess they hadn't spoken in a while. But Paul is wonderful. And I asked Vinny, I said, so Vinny, how was it? This is afterwards, And he goes, Barry, you looked so happy. He goes, your head was glowing and you were floating about a foot off the ground. Right. And I'm like, well, what was Paul doing? He goes, Barry, he's playing guitar. He'd look up at you, smile, shake his head, and then go back to playing. I think you amused him. Like, cause he could tell that this was pretty special. That's one of those things that I'll always cherish. This photo is a big thing, but also the fact that it's in a men's bathroom with a sink, that you can see between us makes it even funnier, but how gracious is that, again, to not only, to be nice enough to show me, Barry, these are the chords to a song I don't play anymore, to, sure, I'll humor you and let you do this. But that was an amazing thing. Yeah. And I also wanted to add too, like, Bruce has always been unbelievable. So at one point, our bass player, Glenn, was having some pretty scary health problems. And Bruce called him. And Glenn McSpirit goes, guess who just called me? And this is on a landline, he's like, Bruce Foxton just called me and hopes I'm doing good. And then every time we saw Bruce afterwards, he'd be like, oh, so Glenn, how you doing, man? How you feeling? Which is just unbelievable to be that nice. And you see the rare experiences that we've had with them are just incredible.
Well, look, this has been such a joy. I love the fact that this came from Andy just dropping me a random email via the website and just saying, look, there's a little story. I don't know if you know this and stuff. And the fact that we've been able to connect and hear your memories, Barry, hear your memories, Andy, has been a real joy, a real delight. So last time you saw Weller live, Andy, it was New York. So this is weird. Like we're flipping around, but you're stateside, you're seeing Paul Weller, and this was the 3 gigs he did where he was meant to do the Jam, the Style Council, and then the Weller solo 3 nights in a row, right? The trilogy.
Yes. Yeah. We went over. Me and Alan, the guy that came with me to interview him all those years ago when we met Barry there. So we were really excited, but it was billed by Rolling Stone magazine, I think, as being one night Style Council, one night Jam, one night something else. And it wasn't like that. And I guess Paul didn't know, right? That was that's how it had been sold. There was a whole load of people from England over there as well. But that's the last time I saw him live. Those gigs were great, by the way. They were really good.
There's some brilliant photos that Lawrence Watson has done of that, which is cool. I think it's called The Trilogy, and he's done photos of different nights in New York, and they're fabulous. You should dig those out. They're really cool. So, Barry, was that your last Weller gig as well?
Actually, no. I had seen him just a few years ago. He came, and he was actually at the Paradise in Boston. And then he came back and I think he did Berkeley. But I did want to say my photos from the trilogy are even better than this other person's because Andy and I were so close that I was taking pictures of Paul's shoelaces just to say, so I've got the picture. I'm like, look how effing close I am. I was very excited to be that close, but I'm like, look how smart dressed, look how sharply dressed this man is. But to show how close I was doing close-ups of his shoelaces with my phone.
Am I right in saying, Barry, that was when Kenny Wheeler then kicked in the restraining order? Was that right?
I see. He looks at me and goes, Barry, 300 meters. I don't know what it is in English.
So final gig for all my cons. Vegas, is that right?
Yeah, we were very fortunate. So we had done the October thing, in 2019. And then we did a beautiful farewell Boston show because it had been 30 years. It was kind of like, we're like, gee, we're actually doing pretty good. Like, we should just end it. Now, these moments where you can actually end and play and have people come, those are fleeting. We did a farewell Boston show in January and a lot of people came. And it was fantastic. We actually got some press saying, oh, final show ever. This is it. And then, you always have friends and colleagues and coworkers that have heard about your life and, your alter ego of things that you've gotten to do where you flew to England for a weekend and played 3 shows and came back, whatever happened. And I'm like, this is your only chance to see us. And people came and that was huge. And then in March, we had a scooter rally in Las Vegas. That was the 3rd time we had played Las Vegas. So we had done, actually the 4th, we had done the Plaza twice, great room. And we played the Sahara Hotel. So just like Elvis, I was happening, and then this was a scooter rally at a place called Backstage Bar and Billiards, and it was a club gig, but it's great because you got all the mods, you got DJs, you got people with the scooters and people dancing and having a fantastic time. We even added one of these guys from the opening band played keyboards. So we did a quick run of A Town Called Malice with him. And that was our final tune. And it was great.
Andy, Barry, this has been such a delight. I had 2 final questions for you before you go. I suppose 4 really, given that there's 2 of you, but you're allowed 1 Paul Weller song for the rest of your life. It can be the Jam, the Style Council, or solo. Andy, kick us off. What would you go with?
Right. So live Jam, that bit that goes between All My Cons and To Be Someone, that where they join it together, just that, every time I listen to it, makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. So I would take that. That's only about a 10-second part, but the actual song would be the whole point. I love that song, the Style Council song. It's just brilliant. And I love the melody. I love the lyrics. and just sort of that moment in time. So for me, it's a really difficult decision, but that would be it.
Nice. Barry, what about you?
Nothing gets my blood going more than live jam, and it's the modern world. This is the modern world. It's just unbelievable. And that's the song where instantly, as soon as I hear that, that is like an electric current going through my nervous system. That's a wonderful song.
That's so funny. I mean, I don't know that I've listened to that album since I bought it. You know, I was caning at the time.
It's all of the energy that is there. If you could plug that in somehow, you could power the entire town of Woking. I don't know.
I think they did probably at one point. Andy, right, final question. So the purpose of this podcast is for me to get the interview with Paul Weller that I never managed during my radio career. It's my one big regret. So I've created a podcast to make it happen. If I get the interview with Weller at the end of the series, what should I ask him? What would you like to know?
So it's not a serious question, Dan. But what I noticed from listening to all of the live stuff, predominantly through Fire and Skill, is that he starts off with that sort of when he's live, this is something called, and then he sort of has this weird osmosis of accents. So I would ask him, I'd like you to ask him, how on earth did that happen? If you listen to some of the early stuff, when they were doing things like Live from a Window and all that, it's really, really sort of a Cockney drawl. And then as they seem to get more successful, and maybe it's developed more of a sense of himself, he loses that and it becomes much more coherent. But it's really strange how it started. And then
brilliant.
I would say, Paul, was that a conscious decision? Were you trying to sound in a particular way or attract a particular element of the audience or what? But yeah, I've always been struck by that. It's a stupid question, but yeah.
It's a great question. I mean, it feels a bit like when I joined the BBC and they insisted on me having elocution lessons. It was a similar thing.
How many lessons did you have? Because has it made any difference?
Well, you can hear. I tell you what it was, right? It was an Essex thing because I was born in Essex. It was, we don't say, why would we say our THs? Everything's, everything and everything and things like that, right? So the BBC had to teach it out of me. That's what it was. Maybe Weller had the same thing.
And relocated you to Surrey.
Yeah, exactly. What about you, Barry? Question for Paul Weller.
Do you remember the men's room incident with Barry from Ahmad Khan's in 1994? And how traumatic was it? Dan, thank you so much for having us. This was a lot of fun.
I will put more details in the show notes. We'll put videos, we'll put photos, but my goodness me, what a lovely conversation. Andy, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Dan, and good luck with the podcast. It's brilliant. Really enjoy it. Thanks.
Oh, well, thank you, Andy. Thank you for listening. And thank you for getting in touch as well. And Barry, lovely to see you stateside. Thanks for skiving off work for us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And thank you again for helping all of us celebrate the best band in the fucking world.
Thanks a lot, guys. See you later.
Cheers.
My thanks once again to Barry Pugatch and Andy Cook. What a story. The story of all Mod Cons, the tribute band, on the podcast as we celebrate 45 years of All Mod Cons by The Jam, the album released on this day, 1978. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do leave a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Share this episode of the podcast on your social media channels. It all helps to spread the word. Do check out the show notes with photos on my website, paulwellerfanpodcast.com. And whilst you're there, why not drop into my store for your official podcast merchandise? You can even get yourself a virtual coffee as well. That would be lovely. On the next episode, I'll give some shout outs to you if you've done exactly that. Plus, on the next episode, legendary promo man Dylan White will be my very special guest. This guy has promoted the music of some of the world's biggest acts. We're talking Oasis, U2, Arctic Monkeys, Primal Scream, The Libertines, Suede, Billy Bragg, Faithless, Fatboy Slim, Joe Strummer, and of course, Paul Weller. Dylan White on the next episode of Desperately Seeking Paul. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.